that he speaks of this phenomenological aspect of, being black, being of different race or color, that you're inhabiting your own body. I mean, there is this split vis-a-vis your body constantly, and this is perhaps one of the most difficult, one of the most difficult, but an entire register of similar aspects of subjugation, which are through which I guess you feel the political repression or violence most directly and actually most violently. So alienation vis-a-vis one's own body is described by Franz Fanon, that is double, since it entails the assumed annihilating gaze of the hegemonic self. He speaks of this awareness of the gaze of the normative subject, what we would call it now normative subject, which is constantly annihilating of this other. And while he inhabits, he describes these experiences himself, while he inhabits his own body, he keeps assuming the perspective of the normative gaze, which is annihilating, as he said, and he still has to assume it as the normative gaze. He tries to mime it, because it is the normative gaze. He has no other possibility of constituting another normative gaze. A fissure of foundational anxiety is introduced by the fact that the gaze of the other, even in relation to oneself, is conditioned by the impossible competence with regard to the gaze of the same. Uncertainty is the foundation of this ontology of otherness. Uncertainty created by the submission, hence dependency in relation to the constitutive gaze to which the other has surrendered its sovereignty and control over itself. The normative gaze of the same had taken away from the other the authority over the gesture of self-identification, a gesture upon which every subject is founded. I'm identical to myself, this Nietzsche speaks of this turning against yourself, this auto-circular gesture. This is foundational of the subject in every epistemological frame, I think. The gesture of self-identification, a gesture upon which every subject is founded, is cancelled. Or there is a tendency to cancel it. One has to perform its cancellation. It is not in fact cancelled. Due to the intrinsic hierarchy of the couple, the same, the other, it is impossible to envision a dialectical reversal that will enable the emancipation of the subjugated term. At this point, we can infer that the subject is never the other. By its definition, it is the identical to itself the same. This does not mean there is no formative conditioning of the same by the other. This is something admitted by Lacan, by others as well. It only means that the subject is not relationally defined. Or rephrasing it in terms of the non-philosophy of François Laurel, it means that it is determined immanently rather than relationally. We can also choose a post-structuralist wording to explain that we admit that the position of the other, the position of the other to be formative, but also that every subject represents a solitary identity in the last instance. The process of subjection, or the subject generation, represents a situation of radical solitude, not only according to Lacan, but also Foucault and their sublimation in Judith Butler. The subject is necessarily universalistic by virtue. So this radical solitude is something which is admitted even by Foucault and Butler, although they speak of this fundamental exposure to the other, of this founding need of the other in order to be constituted as the subject, but in this founding need, tendency, attempt to grasp the other or reach toward the other, you see the solitary gesture of the subject position reaching toward the other. So this radical solitude is something which is more or less admitted even in this, also in this legacy of mostly post-structuralist epistemological background or Korean, whatever post-structuralist means. So, departing from this presupposition that it's a radical solitude, I will claim that it is necessarily universalistic. The subject is necessarily universalistic by virtue of its radically solipsistic status. That is, by virtue of its solitude in the last instance. So it's not just solitude, it's solipsism in a way. Namely, it is radically solitary in producing the gesture of establishing the world, as Orwell would say. And by saying this, we are not disputing the Foucauldian vision about the subject's constitutive affectedness by the world, by the discourse, by the other, about its being inevitably constituted by the dominant normative discourse and power. Our claim is that this givenness of the constitutive normativity is necessarily subjectivized, assumed and realized, rendered tangible and actual through the subject, according to the Foucauldian vision, and that this is a radically solitary process. I mean, the other always evades, even in Foucauldian discourse. Understanding the subject as inevitably universalistic is a theoretical position defended by Alain Badiou and François Laruelle as well. The inevitability of the universalistic character of any subjectivity is the product of the radically solitary character of the gesture of the subject's auto-constitution. An auto-constitution which is endlessly repeated and does not have a history except for the one that is cyclical. Thus, it has a story, a cosmogony or theogony rather than history. I would argue that the radical solitude of the subject's auto-founding gesture and the pretension toward universalism it entails is also implied by the so-called post-structuralist theories of subjectivity. The constitution of the worldview, or in Laruellian terms of the world, is a simultaneous process to that of the constitution of the subject, in its purely formal sense. Or rather, temporally, the subject is never purely formal, and it is made of the discursive material at hand. So, we can think the subject in purely formal terms, but in effect, it's never purely formal, and it is always made of the discursive material at hand, or what Orwell would call the transcendental. So, also by employing the post-structuralist conceptual apparatus indebted to the Foucauldian legacy, one arrives to the conclusion about the radical solitude of the subject position vis-à-vis the discursive universe, and the fact that in spite of its being conditioned by the world, it also must take an active role in the process of subjectivization of the discursive. The process of subjectivization, in spite of its constitutive sociality, is nonetheless a solitary one, since the other is always already mediated through language. I mean, this is almost like a consensus in Foucault, in Lacan, in the analytic philosophy, everywhere. Maybe the terms are different, but the other is always mediated through language. The other in its dimension of the real is never accessible directly. So it is mediated through language. If it is mediated through language, it is mediated through the subject of language. The radical solitude of subjectivization itself necessarily implies a universalistic stance. The subject always makes its best guess. At the center of that lifeless universe, the language is. The subject generates truths about the world and itself. The pretension to truth is never particularistic, since it is an aspiration toward the truth, the right way of acting and thinking, and it is always in the singular. One rationally allows that he or she might be wrong, but one puts his or her stakes in the one truth he or she is passionately attached to. And one is alone in this, and it is universal, because it is the only possible truth in the only possible universe, that of the subject, or the subjectivized discourse power, or in Orwellian terminology, the world. So I am not excluding the fact that, so I'm not disputing the fact that the other, or the discursive, or the world, as Orwell would call it, is constitutive of the subject. I'm merely saying that nonetheless, the subject position in its last instance is radical, solitary, even solipsistic, in a sense, not in Cartesian sense. Understanding the subject as universalistic in the way thus presented makes possible the creation of a form of universalism which is not totalizing, totalitarian, and subjugating. Within such a vision, the constitutive universalism of the subject originates from its fundamental solitude. This position draws on Alain Badiou's thesis about the subject's essential singularity, which refers simultaneously to its fundamental particularity as well as universality, in the sense of performing a universalistic gesture of auto-constitution. It also draws on Laruelle's thesis about the unavoidable unilaterality of thought and subjectivity. So Laruelle claims that the real is thinkable, yet not yet impossible to be reflected by thought. So the subject of knowledge should abandon its pretension to grasp in the form of knowledge, but also as possession, the real, and reflect it in thought. In that sense, knowing the real would be impossible. But in another sense, so correlating with the real and attempting to know the real and establishing certain knowledge of the real, which nonetheless does not reflect the real in its totality in thought, is possible, and this is what Laruelle argues for. So the real is knowable, but not in the sense of traditional philosophy, whereby it would be reflected in totality, in thought or by the thought. It has certain access. It should establish a certain syntax of the real, talk of the real. It can establish language which is basically descriptive, minimalistic in its transcendental pretensions, but it is nonetheless possible. Yet the reflection of the real in its totality, in and by thought, is impossible. So it also draws on Laruelle's thesis about the unavoidable unilaterality of thought and subjectivity. The thinking subject unilaterally attempts to either reflect philosophy or correlate to, which is